blesses again. My God is the God of more than adversity, much more than the all I have given. The Lord has been mindful of me. The Lord has been mindful of me. He blesses and blesses again. My God is the God of the living. How excellent is his name. I'm rich, I am saved, I am happy. I've wealth and prosperity. I've friends, I have doors ever open. The Lord has been mindful of me. The Lord has been mindful of me. He blesses and blesses again. My God is the God of the living. How excellent is his name. Jesus, friend of children, never be a friend to me. Hold my hand and always keep me close to thee. The little flower that opens, the little bird that sings, God made their glowing colors, he made their tiny wings. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. The cold wind in the winter, the pleasant summer sun, the ripe fruits in the garden, he made them every one. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. He gave us eyes to see them, and lips that we might tell how great is God Almighty, who has made all things well. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Yes, for me, he careth with loving tender care. Yes, with me, he shareth each burden and
Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. As you know, technology sometimes has a mind of its own, so trying to get the printer to cooperate. Karen couldn't get the PowerPoint sent over. It's been a little bit of a crazy time, but we got the stuff printed. So if you need a handout for the sermon, they're in both lobbies there. It's got like a weighting feature where it can weigh the paper. So when it's printing it, if it gets too full, then it'll let you know, hey, it's too full. It would print like 5 sheets of paper and be like, oh, hey, it's too full. So I don't know if it's just not strong enough anymore. It's just been carrying the weight too long. I don't know. But it's So he kept having to take it off, let it print again. It's a nuisance. Not that you really care, but technology. So it's good to see you all this morning. Glad you're here. We are in Acts 15, and then, Lord willing, we're hoping to move into 16 this morning. Okay. Now, we kind of talked about decisions relating to matters of opinion last week, and kind of looking back through 15, of course, we've been dealing with this issue around opinion. And there's dissension over these matters of opinion. We talked about that last week and the week before. There's discussion about the matters of opinion. We talked about that as well. There's decisions made. And that's kind of where we left off going into the final little piece of division that happens. And we talked about division as well some there at the end. And the division is, of course, over who again? It's between Paul and Barnabas, but who's it over? John Mark, right? And Barnabas wants to take him. Of course, Paul doesn't. Paul is very adamant about not taking Barnabas. And the reality is, whether or not John Mark goes, does it really matter when it comes to doctrine? Does it matter when it comes to truth or the gospel, whether or not he goes? No, it doesn't, right? So you have right here clearly a matter of opinion between two men who are both faithful to the gospel, faithful to the work of the kingdom and the work of God, but they have a differing opinion, and it led so far that these two men that have done so much work together and done so much great work in God's name and God's honor together, they split and go their separate ways. And you kind of stop and think back through this situation, and of course, remember, there's an opinion. What was the opinion that's caused this whole chaos? Just as a quick reminder. Circumcision, right? You have those that are trying to force circumcision on those who have not been circumcised, and it's led to this big debate and this big frustration, and so they called Paul and Barnabas to go and appear before this group of men, and so they do, and after kind of hearing the different spills, the discussion that's going on, remember, Peter speaks first, and what does Peter recall again? What does he go back to and talk about? What happens in Acts 10? Where does Peter go? Starts with Cor, ends with Cornelius. Okay, Cornelius' household. So Peter goes to a Gentile man's home and preaches to him. And so Peter's retelling this whole situation, this whole conversion story in verses 6 through about 11 there of of Acts 15. And in that, why would he be going back to that and using that and bringing that up in this deal with circumcision? Okay. So you think about, they talk about, not keeping the law then. How do you think you're going to keep it now? And but when you think about that situation, in Galatians, Paul often refers to, and you'll see this referred to several times in different letters, if you see the word circumcision, a lot of times not talking about what they're talking about in Acts 15, but those of the circumcision are who? Jews. Those of the uncircumcision would be the Gentiles. Anyone who's not a Jew, that's a Gentile, right? So in Galatians, you see that mentioned a lot as Paul's doing the comparison. And in Galatians 3 there, I believe it is, when he says there's no longer Jew nor Greek, right? So there is no longer circumcised, uncircumcised. There's no longer a division between these two. So Cornelius being a Gentile, more than likely then was what? Those of the uncircumcision, uncircumcised. So why would Peter bring this whole situation up? It seems that he's bringing that up to kind of say, hey, I was called to go preach to Cornelius and to these Gentiles. Circumcision wasn't part of that message, right? The act itself. So he's kind of going to this situation saying, here's a group of Gentiles. If God wanted that to be the message, right, then wouldn't he have had me preach that to the Gentiles? Wouldn't I have had to say that to Cornelius and his household that, okay, you've been baptized, but next step, your whole household has to be circumcised. Anyone who's not must be, right? So Peter kind of calls that to memory and is telling that story. And then the next person that speaks up is Paul. They're Paul and Barnabas. And that's verse 12. And what do Paul and Barnabas recount? What are they talking about in verse 12? Okay, we're back to the work that's dealing with Gentiles. And they're saying, hey, we did many signs and wonders. We've done a lot of miracles with the Gentiles. This wasn't part of our message. And then the third person is James, the brother of Jesus. And James is a pillar in the church at Jerusalem. You see that in Galatians 1 and Galatians 2. He directed attention to the Old Testament predictions of God granting salvation to the Gentiles. He quotes Amos. It's a reference to Amos 9, verses 11 and 12. Predictions that also said nothing about circumcision. So you have these three different statements saying, hey, in dealing with Gentiles, God's plan, God's call, this has not been part of what God has said preach. This has not been part of what God has said, hey, they need to do this. And so that's kind of what's brought up there. Then there's decisions that are made. Do you remember the decision? There's kind of some pieces to it. What do they ultimately decide to do? Someone say something? Do what now? Well, they end up parting ways. But when they're standing before all these men and the elders here and they're having this discussion about the matter, what do they decide to do about the matters of opinion, specifically about the situation with the circumcision and the debate, right? They basically first, Judas and Silas, which are labeled as leading men in the congregation in verse 22, they were sent to Antioch in behalf of the uncircumcised to go and to kind of give their account. And also, there's a letter that is written. And that letter was a letter of acceptance, and it was written first to denounce the opinion that had been imposed on them, saying, hey, this is not a command from God now. This is not part of what you have to do. But then they go on to say in the letter, this isn't part of it, but this is. You remember? They tell them to stay away from things that would hinder them growing, right? So if you go back and you look at the letter, it's in verse 29. These are the necessary things, right? Abstain from things offered to idols. Abstain from blood, from things strangled, from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you do well, farewell. So that's the letter to kind of encourage them. Hey, this is an opinion. It's not bound on you. Do it, don't do it, it doesn't matter. But this does matter. Stay away from these things. Abstain from this. Keep away from this. So that's kind of what happens. And those are the decisions that are made. Then there's the division that happens. Barnabas was determined to take John Mark, but Paul insisted on doing otherwise in verse 38. The unwavering resolve is implied in the words determined and insisted, showing you that both men, they've done a lot of great things, but both men were unwilling to waver in their opinion about John Mark, right? So you look and Barnabas is determined. Paul insisted no. That's more intense than just, well, Barnabas kind of wanted to take John Mark, but Paul said, no, we're not going to do that this time, right? When you're determined, you work hard and you fight for it, right? So when you're determined about an opinion, you fight for your opinion. Just debate someone when it comes, if you enjoy sports, find someone else who enjoys sports, and then y'all talk about your favorite teams, or y'all talk about who the greatest basketball player of all time is if you like basketball. There is no debate, but somebody try to throw LeBron in there, and we'll pray for those people. But Michael Jordan's the greatest of all time. I do like LeBron too, in terms of what he's accomplished. I don't like his attitude. But anyways, in those debates that you can get heated, and you're both determined to prove your point, right, about who's the best, whether it's Eli or Peyton Manning or Tom Brady, whether it is Michael Jordan or LeBron, whether it is this team or that team. And I'm just talking about sports because that's an area where I fall into and love and am passionate about. But it doesn't have to be that. It can be a lot of different things. So these words used here are very intentional to show you that both men are not wavering. They're not going to give in. They're going to stick to their guns about their opinion. And it leads to a split, a division. And that's the end of chapter 16. Now, Paul chooses Silas. Barnabas takes, of course, Mark. Paul chooses Silas. And Paul goes through Syria and Cilicia, verse 41, strengthening the churches, building them up. Still can carry on doing the work of the Lord. But you have a division here of two men who work well together, have done a lot of great, wonderful things together for God's name and glory. But it shows you that opinions can lead to this if we're not careful. And if we fight too hard for something that really doesn't matter as much as we're making it out to matter. Thoughts or comments? Eric. Yeah. And I'm sure that probably made Paul even more frustrated, you know. But yeah, Barnabas, we often talk about Barnabas in what vein, in what area do we discuss him? Do what? Encouragement, right? And you think about it, he was very giving, right? He gave of his hands, he gave of his means in Acts 4, I believe it is, when he's part of the group that's selling their stuff to help those that are in need among the Christian brethren there. He was very encouraging, and he did choose to stand up for those when others might not. Paul, for example, everybody doubted him, and Barnabas said, no, we need to welcome him. And then here Paul is, not wanting to take John Mark, and Barnabas, I tend to agree. I wonder if he did bring it up. Remember what I did for you, Paul, when everybody else didn't want you to be around and I kind of stuck up for you? Now, Paul comes back around, doesn't he? And eventually he gets to a point and he says, I want you to call John Mark, for he's good for my ministry. He's good for me. I need John Mark. He gets there, but he needs some time to get there. But yeah, Barnabas is, and you look at him, there's actually a book, some of you probably read it, it's been out for a while now, called The Barnabas Factor, written by a man named Aubrey Johnson. I don't know if he still preaches at Peachtree City in Georgia, but I know that's where he was. But good book, really good book, and it's all about encouragement. And all that you can learn from that. Imagine how much different things would feel if people focused on encouraging rather than discouraging. And if people didn't hide their destructive comments behind a label of constructive criticism. There is a such thing as constructive criticism, but I think that term sometimes is abused to soften the maybe words that are used that could have been used in a different way or chosen differently. Yeah, Barnabas is a great person to emulate, to encourage people. A very humbling question is, ask yourself, after interacting with people, did I make their day better or worse? Am I someone people avoid because I'm Debbie Downer, negative Nancy, whatever phrase you want to use? Am I someone people avoid because maybe I'm not even that? Maybe I just offered more discouragement than encouragement. Maybe I offer more gossip than good, healthy conversation. Or am I someone people come to talk to because that stuff's not my vocabulary. That stuff's not what I focus on. I focus on building up, not tearing down. That can be a very humbling question, but it can answer a lot and kind of give you insight as to maybe some things to think about and work on. Because Barnabas was one that tried to build up and encourage and stood up for those that maybe others wouldn't at times, and was very giving of his means to those in need, and great godly man. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, he did. He didn't stay back. He stepped forward and dealt with the things that needed to be dealt with, and he dealt with them when? Then. Galatians 2, when he calls Peter out face to face in front of people, because it needed to be done then. It wasn't something that needed to wait. It had to be. If he didn't do it then, maybe those standing around might think that's okay behavior. Maybe those standing around might think, oh, it's no big deal. Peter can do whatever. But Paul calls him out and says, hey, you can't pretend to be friends with the Gentiles, and when the Jews come around, treat them terribly and join the Jews. Like, you can't be a hypocrite like that, Peter. And so Paul dealt with a lot of things, and he didn't have time. It seems with John Mark, John Mark leaving, now that was an inconvenience to their trip, right? That was a frustration, I'm sure. And so Paul's response perhaps gives us insight into the possibility that his mindset was, I don't have time to waste time. I need to get these things done. I got to get here. I got to do this. I got to do that. And I don't need things that could hinder me from doing what I need to do. Anybody here, someone that you just can't sit down? You got to have something going on all the time? My dad's that way. I'd come in from college and on a Friday night, and I'd be like, all right, well, I'm going to wash the car in the morning. He's like, all right. I'd wake up, and I wouldn't even sleep in that late for a college student. I'd wake up at like 8:30 or 9, and he's already got it like detailed, like something that he's been doing since like 7:30 or 7. And I'm like, Dad, I told you I was going to, but he just can't sit still anymore. He just has to be working, which is crazy because he just retired. So we're going to see how that goes. But anybody else, you just can't sit still? Yes, sir. My dad's actually 180 Houston Street, Dunlap, Tennessee. He likes to work on cars and stuff like that. That's what he's done for the state for so many years. So he'll probably do something like that. But he's one of those you just can't stop and slow down, which isn't. It's great, but you need to slow down. But Paul's kind of like that, it seems. He's just always going and getting and doing and involved, and and that's the thing that kind of reminds us he's like that. Because there's always something that can be done or needs to be done. And that's true for us today in the church and in the work of the church. There's always something to do. If you're standing around like, I don't know what to do, well, there's something. I promise there's something. Especially like when you got the events that we have going on. We have a lot of things going on right now. You got the size of the building that we have. There's always things going on to I know that Eric and them kind of oversaw a cleaning of the third floor area. And, I mean, you can still see the dumpster. They're supposed to pick that up a while ago, but they haven't yet. But there's a lot going on. So there's always something to do. And, idle hands, what is it? Are devil's workshop, and so you got to be. Jesus rested, but then he got back to work. Paul, I'm sure, rested, even though we don't really see it as much, but he was working, and it's a good mindset for us, no matter your age. I think kids really struggle with where they fit, like what is my purpose? How do I help the church? And I think that happens as you get older too. I think that sometimes maybe some I'll call them veteran Christians, those that have been Christians for many, many years, they might get to a point where they're like, well, I can't do this anymore, I can't do that anymore, I can't do this anymore. What's my purpose? I just want you to know that you have a purpose, and there's always something to do. And there's no such thing as minor work or little work in terms of significance when it comes to church work. Whether that is hanging clothes up next door, sorting through clothes next door, giving Judy a hard time while she's hanging the clothes up next door just to keep her humble. Whatever it is, find a way to plug in. And even if you can only do so much, so little you think, it does matter. And I kind of get that from looking at the constant activeness of Paul and these men that are going. They're just constantly going and staying plugged in. And that's what Paul says in when he's talking to the Philippians, isn't it? Like, For me to live as Christ, but to die is gain. So while I live, I'm going to live for His glory, so that when I die, I can receive my crown of life. And he says to the Philippian brethren, I long to be with Him because it's far greater, but you need me here, so I'll stay here and toil here. In other words, I'm going to work here till I can't work anymore, till I'm called to be home. So don't feel like you don't matter or your work is insignificant because you can only do so much or what. It all matters when it comes to church work. And when the church gets that, man, it's a beautiful thing to see. Other thoughts, comments? I want to tell you this. Your opinions, we're not trying to belittle what your opinions may be about any subjects. That's not the point of Acts 15. That's not the point of the last 2 or 3 weeks of class. Your opinions matter to you, and that means they're important to you. But we have to realize that just because an opinion is important to me doesn't mean it is to someone else, number one. And number two, it doesn't make it binding with God. I cannot bind my opinion like it's a truth from God. I have to be careful with that. The problem is, I don't think any of you would disagree with me on that. But as we've said before, the problem is we struggle with the two columns. Well, is this an opinion or is this a doctrine? Is it a teaching from God? We struggle with what goes in which column. And some people really fight hard for an opinion because they've moved it to their doctrine column, but it's not in God's doctrine column. Circumcision, Acts 15. And so, talk about your opinions. Discuss them. Have passion about them. But also be gentle and be humble and realize when it is an opinion and that it's okay to disagree, right? Because your opinion, the disagreement on the opinion will not keep anyone out of heaven. However, the way you treat your opinion, if we're not careful, might keep us from going to heaven if we have the wrong heart and attitude in the approach of it. Sometimes just take on the Elsa approach. Let it go. Let it go. Yeah. Sometimes it's okay to let it go and be wrong. However, Laura, that doesn't mean all the time. Okay? Yeah. Exactly. You know, when you think of the church and some of these things that happen, ultimately, if you say, I won, this person lost in that debate of opinion, whatever, ultimately, if there's a loser between the two, then the church as a whole loses. How many opinions have created and generated dissension, splits, pain within churches? And one person might have liked it because they got their way, but they got their way at the expense of what? The church and the positivity that was going on. And so it's okay to accept defeat. It's okay to say you're sorry, and just so you can move on from something, even if you know you didn't do anything wrong. My dad is an elder, and I heard him one time. I don't know what the conversation was about, but people would typically come to my dad with problems because he was a good listener, easy to talk to, pretty level-headed. And so I just heard him saying on the phone, I'm sorry, whatever. And then later on, we're talking about something else, and he basically told me that, you know, sometimes, even when you know you didn't do something wrong or you're not in the wrong, so that everyone can move on and things can get peaceful and be normal, the best thing to do might just be to say sorry and move on from it, instead of fight so adamantly for that position or whatever else. And I think there's a lot of truth to that in our conversations with one another, not just between an elder and a member, but between people, that it's okay to accept defeat and just be what we say, the bigger person, so we can move on from it. Yes, Ms. Joseda. Yeah. Yeah, and of course they didn't split the church. They just kind of split off from their work together. Do what now? No, that's what we were saying earlier. The John Mark thing. The reason we say this whole chapter is opinion, because you have the opinions on circumcision, and then there's the opinion about John Mark. Neither one of those are doctrinal, and the one with John Mark wasn't even spiritual. It was more personality or work ethic. I don't know. Paul didn't want to take him because of what had happened, but it wasn't because John Mark was teaching error or whatever else, right? And so it shows you that the opinions aren't necessarily exclusively spiritual opinions that can lead to dissension and splits and hurt within the church. But here's the thing, and I mentioned this last Sunday. People are scared to talk about their opinions. Did you know that? People are not just that. People are scared, I think, to ask questions in a Bible class because they're afraid others will look at them like, number one, they should know the answer. Number two, they're way wrong and they must be liberal if they're thinking something like that. And we get on these terms. It's just, we've created an environment that says, oh yeah, we want to have these conversations. But then we treat people terribly in the conversation, so nobody wants to have the conversations. We talked about an article last week, or a podcast that had come out, and then there was an article in response to the conversation on the podcast, and attacked and belittled the people on the podcast for what they had said. And I'm not getting in, if you know what I'm talking about, I'm not getting into the discussion of whether or not it was an opinion or it was actually doctrine. We don't have time to do all that because we'd be here for way, way too long. And but my point is, even in the matter of doctrine, the approach to it was not the best. Could have been better. And that's what leads to people just sitting in a pew and not talking, because they're afraid of what people will think about them or say about them or say to them because of their questions. They're sincere questions, and they're trying. You can't grow in your faith without asking questions. Did you know that? You have to ask questions if you want to grow. Yet we make people feel like they can't because of the way that others are treated. And it might not have been the way they've been treated, but they've seen someone else be treated a certain way. So they're scared to talk up. I know that's not why y'all don't speak up in this class. You're just mesmerized by my teaching abilities, but or put to sleep. But no, I do think that's a problem. And I don't know how you really fix it, except when questions are asked, you handle them the right way. Now, I've not seen any crazy outbursts in this auditorium class or in any classes I've taught here. We've had very healthy discussions in classes. We've had some really good, healthy discussions in the Tuesday class that I really enjoyed. And that was our goal, was to create an environment on those Tuesdays where people could ask questions or voice their thoughts about passages or about what it meant to be a follower of Jesus was our main theme. And so that's what when you generate that and you have people asking questions, that leads to growth and excitement and positivity. And that leads to learning how to agree to disagree, right? That learning how to be like, okay, we obviously disagree on this. It's not a big deal because it's an opinion. But we don't know how to handle that because we don't have those conversations much anymore. Thoughts? Maybe I'm wrong. That's kind of some thoughts I have in looking at this text and just thinking about overall what we've kind of been talking about. Eric? Oh. Yeah. Yeah. The right message delivered the wrong way does just as much harm as the wrong message delivered the right way. And I've not seen, now, again, I've not seen some of these things we're talking about in the 2 years that I've been here. And this is just kind of our natural progression through Acts. But these are things to keep in mind in your interactions with people, because I have seen these things while I've been here just among Christians. Thank you, social media, I guess. But and so it just makes you think. And the way people handled everything through COVID and through a lot of those issues, and then when election time comes around, man, you see a lot, don't you? When it comes to the way Christians treat each other. I'm talking vicious. And between elections, between COVID all happening, like all that stuff, the church, I don't know if the church's name was thought of in the best light during all that stuff. And so ask yourself, when you leave and go out, you are representing God, right? Every day, and representing Jesus. But as a member of, now I know not everybody here this morning is a member at Central, but if you're a member somewhere else, wherever you are a member, you're also a representative of that congregation wherever you go. So people are going to connect what you're doing, what you're saying, how you're living, to wherever you worship. They're going to bring all those connections together. Just keep those kinds of things in mind. Have healthy conversations so that you can grow and others can grow. Next week, we'll jump into chapter 16 as Timothy joins Paul and Silas, and we'll talk about the Macedonian call, the imprisonment of Paul and Silas. We'll talk about some great things going on in chapter 16, and we'll kind of move from there. Thank you all for being here. There are handouts in both lobbies for the sermon. Make sure to meet someone new today. Meet someone new you've not met before. And don't be scared that you should know the person. Just meet them. All right? Thank you all for being here. We'll see you again in just a moment.
Yeah.